Mr. President, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for your interest in ICRC's work and thinking about religion and humanitarian action.
Indeed, we would very much like to ask you two questions. And the first question would be, how do you see the contribution of faith-based organizations to humanitarian assistance and protection in armed conflicts?
Religions at large and faith-based organizations are, in terms of values and norms and morality, are big sources of encouragement and of humanitarian action. ICRC in the field sees faith-based organizations responding to the most elementary needs of people. The commitment to human dignity, which is enshrined in religions and in faith-based organizations, is basically the core out of which the core which drives humanitarian action of faith-based organizations. When I look at our past, the founder of ICRC was a man of faith. And at the same time, he knew that in order to do good humanitarian action in conflicts, you needed to have neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action in order to not spur the conflict further, but to mitigate the consequences of violence. So it is important today that when faith-based organizations deliver humanitarian assistance, are active in the field, that they also respect those basic principles of humanitarian action, which are neutrality and impartiality. And I think from the beginning of humanitarian action 150 years ago as public policies, we have felt that tension, that on the one side, faith is a big source of motivation for humanitarian action, and engaging in humanitarian action then needs neutrality, impartiality, and independence.
Thank you very much indeed. And then allow me to ask you a second question about international humanitarian law and faith-based organizations. How do you see faith-based organizations as promoting the better respect for international humanitarian law in armed conflicts?
Faith-based organizations and religious leaders are important leaders in the community. They have an influence with parties to conflict. They have an influence with armed groups, with armies. Their voice is heard, and their commitment to a rule-based society is of critical importance. So the commitment of faith-based organizations, of religious leaders to international humanitarian law and its values are absolutely critical in order to ensure respect for these laws in the practical life. Faith-based organizations and religious leaders can open doors for actors like the ICRC. They can ensure that the basic values enshrined in the Geneva Convention in international humanitarian law, and which are not different from the norms and values transported by different religions, that these norms are respected and are taken seriously by the respective armed groups in conflict, that civilians are protected, that the distinction is made between civilian and military objectives, that health facilities are not attacked in conflict, that women, girls, boys, men are not violated in those conflicts, that humanitarian actors have an ability to access those populations. So everything which is enshrined in the Geneva Convention as law is at the same time a basic value that faith-based organizations and leaders can transport, and where their influence is so critical to ensure respect.
Oh, thanks again. And would you have a wish for an improvement of the cooperation between the ICRC and faith-based humanitarian organizations?
I think for the ICRC it is of critical importance to have partners in the field with whom we share values and operational principles. And in each and every place, I think we can only respond adequately if we have a close understanding on how we assist and protect people. What is the biggest danger with faith-based organization is when faith and religion become an element of identitarian exclusion. When faith-based organizations organize their humanitarian activities and assistance according to brethren and sistren in faith instead of needs that we perceive, human needs that we assess in the field. So my wish would be that faith-based organizations are solid partners in neutral and impartial and independent humanitarian assistance.
Mr. President, could you give us one example of the cooperation of the ICRC with faith-based organizations?
You may know that the ICRC, because of the multiplicity of conflict in the Islamic world, has worked for the last 15 years with different faith-based organizations in the Islamic world, Sunni and Shia and other currents of religious leaders also. Today, for instance, for the last couple of years, we had a particular engagement with the Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf, and who is an important voice with Shia militias. And his engagement for the respect of international humanitarian law and his fatwa, which instructs Islamic fighters to respect international humanitarian law, has been very critical to open the door for dialogue with the armed groups, and at the same time to be in contact with a leader, a religious leader like the Ayatollah. But this is happening in more other conflicts, and it is happening with religious leaders, with faith-based organizations, with an influence of with the militias and with armed groups in the field. It's absolutely critical for ICRC to have these contacts, this input, and I think we have been able, through this kind of dialogue, to foster understanding for international law and to improve the respect for this law in the region.